It's Lil
assimilating
Baby.
to everything else life,
Yeah.
you're like, how much some people feel like they can't be fully themselves, or they can't figure out their identity, or it takes them time to
I'm very
be in their
curious.
skin.
I'm very curious. I think we're rolling. We're rolling?
It's
Yeah.
Lil Baby.
Welcome to episode 11 of Conversations with Chai. Today I have with me, I really want to call her Narmeen, but I have the first Bangladeshi, the first Muslim woman to anchor in New York City.
Yeah.
We have with us Miss Narmeen Choudhury. Yeah,
Thank you for having me.
absolutely. Thank you for doing this.
I really appreciate it. Yeah.
So we were talking about this outside, and I'll just like start there because your family immigrated here pretty early in the sense of like Bangladeshis that moved to America. You said your parents were here 70.
Yeah, so my dad came shortly after Bangladesh independence, so like early 70s. I might get the year wrong, but it's 72, I believe, is when
Okay.
my dad came.
You're like
My
a
mom
born
came
and
right
bred
after.
like New Yorker, right? So you've been here, so like
I'm the real thing. I'm here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Born and bred, first generation immigrant. Yeah, I was born in Jamaica, Queens. My mother immigrated here just a couple of years before I was born. Like, so right after my dad and my mom got married in Bangladesh, she immigrated here in 79.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you notice a difference in like growing up, like what the era that you grew up? Because like I think like a lot of like immigrant stories like now, like the more common one is like, hey, the first gen moved in like late 80s, maybe like throughout the 90s,
Yeah.
right? So we're seeing like the first gen like kind of like my age and like below,
Yeah.
right? But like you grew up when like New York City
I'm
was
older than you.
no. But you grew up when New York City was like a lot less Bengali. Like
It
not like
wasn't
I never
less Bengali.
like
I mean,
will.
I say growing up in Queens, it's funny because even the neighborhood that I grew up in, now I pop out on the subway and I'm surrounded by Bangladeshis. That was not the case when I was growing up. I mean, we joke about it, like, because a lot of my elementary school friends, we didn't even used to ask like where you from, because people were literally from everywhere. We had friends that were Black, Hispanic, every kind of Arab. There was, yes, the Bangladeshis. There was Indians. There was Pakistanis, Asian. Like, there was such a mixed group of friends in our schools and in our neighborhoods. And then we would come home, and I lived in a building that people used to jokingly refer to as the embassy building, because people would hop off the plane from Bangladesh into New York and come to this building. It was like, so they joking. And I thought for the longest time into adulthood, I thought the name of the building was the embassy building. And I realized it's not. But yeah, but then at home, you're really surrounded by this extended family of your family friends, your parents' friends, who are all Bangladeshi. Other kids are all around the same age, first and second born kids, all around the same age. And then you're immersed in your Bangladeshi life. You know, that was,
I think that's
different.
I think that's why it's hard for Bangladeshis to not be like ingrained in their culture, because their culture is like literally like forced around them, right? To a degree. Like you have, like for me, like it was like a byproduct of having like a huge Bangladeshi family, right? So it's like my best friends were my like cousins, right? My distant cousins, right? And we all kind of like, especially when you're young, right? Like you're going where your parents are like taking you, right? So I was like always around a lot of Bangladeshis, but it was
also like growing up, I would say in the 90s, like you're like, let's say Bangla schools and like your masjid, like Sunday school, your Islamic schools, those were already established. Like when we were growing up, like my dad was the among the founding members and first president of the Jamaica Muslim Center. They created their own masjid. They created their own houses of worship. They created their own Bangla schools, which really wasn't a Bangla school. It was somebody's apartment, you know, learning Robin Shonge, then, you know, learning about, you know, doing Ekushe February programs and things like that were all just very, very organically and done low key. Compared to now, it's like, I feel like people are like, oh, which one are we going to? Because there's multiple. So yeah, they were very much part of the group that was establishing a footprint and of holding on to their culture so desperately, and also at the same time trying to make sure that they were instilling the culture, and religion was a huge part of it, into their kids as well. While also, and then so many of us as we were growing up, it was a struggle to kind of break free a little bit of that and be able to be, you know, be the American version of what they wanted, of what we wanted to be as well. And so many people went in so many different directions that way.
But I think that's like the coolest thing, right? Because their thing was establishing a foothold, right?
Yeah,
But
for
then
sure.
our generation ends up being the advancement of that foothold, right? By just like pure virtue of like doing whatever we're doing, right? Like even yourself for like an example, right? Like you put a Bangladeshi in front of like a major news market, right? So like that in itself is like the advancement of our culture, not by virtue of anything. It's just by the virtue of whoever you are, right? You're a Bangladeshi woman that is on the face of this, right? Like
But it's also
you can't take
it's
that
not
away.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. Thank you. I think it was hard because also you know, a lot of us, even I use it in today's standards. Like I have two daughters, 9 and the little one's turning 5 tomorrow, and you know they live their lives, and you know social media is such a big play and things like that. You know they always look up to somebody. There's always like a YouTube star or you know a social media star or an influencer of some kind that's kind of shaping people's dreams, aspirations. And growing up, what did we have? You know, like my dad religiously watched the evening news. He would flip between the major networks, and it was all predominantly white men on television. So people will be like, who did you possibly look up to want to be in the news business? You never saw anybody that looked like you. You most certainly didn't see somebody who had your very lengthy name scrolled across the bottom of the screen. And it was probably a big reason that like my dad and, you know, not so much my mom, my dad especially really like didn't push for it. Or frankly didn't understand it. He was like, "What are you doing?"
Because it doesn't seem realistic, right? Because you don't see anybody who does
He was
it.
like, this is not something that's going to work out. He was like, I was actually really, I don't want to call it embarrassed, but I had a hard time telling my parents that this is what I was majoring in college.
What did
I
you?
hid it.
What did you do? You hid it.
I hid it for a little bit until the acceptance letters started coming, and they were like, "Why is this for the communications program?" And the funny thing is, the person that discouraged me the most, my father, who is the biggest news buff, and instilled in me from a very young age how important current events is in our lives, not just what's happening in your immediate community,
Yeah.
but an understanding of what's happening around the world and why it relates to your neighborhood and your community. He would quiz me on current events, world leaders, state capitals, country capitals around the world. He always did that. So I was like, the man who discouraged me the most was the biggest reason I wanted to do journalism.
Isn't it so funny how that works out?
And now he's like the biggest fan of the decision that I made. It took him some time. It took probably 5 years into my career, and another random Pakistani family in Connecticut talking about seeing a Choudhury, a Desi girl on the news at a family friend function that my dad was at. My dad was like, "Wait, that's my daughter that they're talking about." It took that for him to finally recognize what I had been trying to tell him, that our representation is very important in these spaces. It's amazing that we have as many doctors and people in law and so many and engineering. It's great, but we need to like spread out in so many other spaces.
We haven't done this yet.
Yeah,
like we haven't done this yet.
So I
right.
was like, so it took a moment. I had to wear him down, but he got it finally.
I think like our parents like really ask. It's so funny that you say that because I just had this conversation with my dad like very, very recently, right? He's like, why do you like, he's like, I think you think that whatever you're trying to do, like, do you know anybody? Like, I don't think that's just gonna happen, right? And that's like a very uncomfortable conversation to have.
But he's a journalist himself.
That's the funniest thing, right?
Yeah.
Like he doesn't understand that this is a byproduct of who he was. Like he can't see that yet, right?
Sometimes in immigrant mentalities, I gotta say, I think a lot of what drives what they believe is success is how much money you can put away in the bank. I mean, it really is. I mean, and I don't fault their generation for thinking that way. I mean, for my father, getting out of Queens, buying a home in Hudson Valley, and spending an insane amount of time working on his garden and having property is what you push for.
Well, that was obviously when they came here, like that's their only version of success, right? Because like these things that like we're trying to do or doing, right? We're not even in like the realm of possibility. It's like still a reach for, like it's a reach for you.
We wouldn't even know who to call to get there. Yeah.
it's like a reach for you to do what you did, right? And even then, like, you had to like go through things to go get it, right? They had to go through things to barely like establish like, hey, like I like live here for real, right? Like you can't just
Yeah.
ship me back, right? Like I have a home here, I have, so like that's their version of like we made it, right?
And we're still working through a lot of things. Like as much as we have South Asian and Muslim journalists, we're so few and far between. And you're still working your way through these spaces. There were so many times, trust me, that I wanted to give up. Because I was like, maybe they were right. Maybe it is pointless. I'm working through people whose fathers were frat brothers with the head of this station or the owner of this news corporation and the other. Or this person had this other connection, because they were able to do unpaid internships and I had no business accepting an unpaid internship because how would I possibly feed myself? Not ask my parents for money. They didn't have the capability of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, there were some times that I felt like every obstacle that could be in your way as a brown Muslim woman trying to be a face in front of the camera in the news business, yeah, it was all thrown at me. And there's so many amazing, amazing journalists I know that left the business because of the very same factors that I tried pushing through. And it sucks. It really sucks. It still happens today.
I think that's like something that we have to face as like South Asians is because like we almost have a clock to prove, hey, we can do this, right? Like if you like again, like people getting turned away in the industry, right? It's like, hey, you have to continuously like keep going at it for them to give it to you, right? Because it's not going to be easy, right? Like it's not going to
wear them down.
But you have to wear them down, right?
Yeah.
But you also have
And
to
it's
put
exhausting.
and you have to put in the sacrifices and the battles. Like I'm sure it wasn't like easy for you. What was that like? Like coming in, right? Like was that a goal? Was that an approach? Like, hey, I'm gonna go be here. Was that an active like, hey, I'm gonna go shoot at this?
I think one of the biggest things was making sure that my work ethic and my drive showed past anything else, because I got told all kinds of things. Like they didn't know what to make of my name. They didn't want. I've had people ask my agent if I would consider changing my last name, because who can pronounce Choudhury? Well, a lot of people can.
Is that a real thing? Like them asking you, like, hey, can you change it? Really?
Yeah. A news director at one of the top New York stations asked my agent if I would consider changing my last name to a Rodriguez or a Garcia. I'm like, what? No.
Really?
Yeah, true story.
See, like that is insane to me because I think like we think about it like in the sense of like, hey, like this happens, right? But I don't think that like we ever get like confirmation. Like
there are people that have like changed their names for simplicities. There's instances of white journalists who've changed their names throughout this business really for the sake of like, so it's easier for like an audience to remember your name, or or sometimes maybe privacy. I don't know, like they like to have this television persona and their personal persona be separate. Fine. But I do know, I mean, it happened directly with me, but in particular, as more people of color were working their way into the industry, for me, it was like, he was like, I don't know what box to check with her. What box would she check?
Do you check a box for them?
No, I like would refuse to. Well, because I was like, if you don't understand where I, a born and raised New Yorker of South Asian descent, Muslim woman, fits into the New York market, then I don't think you know the New York market that you're leading.
But that was like the source of my question, right? Because
But I also don't say that to the news director that I'm trying to get a job
No, of
with.
course, right? But this
is a conversation I would have to have with my agent, which was, it is your job as my kind of intermediary to make them understand that no, like this is my identity. My name is not something I would ever have considered changing. I will say, like, as difficult as sometimes I think my upbringing could be in terms of internally battling my culture, my faith, how much of my American side I want to be.
Yeah.
I think I really, really am so incredibly amazed at how my parents did it. My father was always very religiously conservative. My mother was very culturally conservative. So I had these two battles, but my father was always like, if there was ever a moment of not being proud of where you came from or being embarrassed about being Muslim or being embarrassed about being Bangladeshi, like they dispelled that so fast, it was never ingrained in me. If anything, and if I was ever like made fun of for any reason, I was like, proudly say I'm Muslim, proudly say I'm Bangladeshi. Like that's something and I don't know where it came from because I know friends who grew up exactly the same way I did, but they didn't come out of it that same way with the same pushback. Some of them did kind of
I think
push down their identity until they felt more comfortable as they got older.
I think who your dad probably played a part in it, right?
Right.
Like your dad is somebody who's like, founding member of Jamaica Muslim Center, right? Like those are like things that like you see even as a kid and you're like, you feel like somewhat of a pride in it, right? Like even like who like my dad like was, right? Like I was just like, okay, like you're a real legit Bengali journalist. Like you influence a community, right? Like,
Yeah.
and it is a part of, it's not my direct community, but it is a part of my community, right? And I think that's like important to like acknowledge because you have to understand like where that like affinity for your culture like comes from because it should come from somewhere, right? Like it's so easy for us to just be like, yo, I don't need to associate with any part of it. Like I really don't, right? Like I can just.
And there are some people I think when it gets like forced into their lives in some ways, there are some people that really don't want to have anything to do with it. And listen, everybody has their own experiences. For me, I think it was, it goes through these like moments, but I think I always felt balanced in that way.
How was that moment? Like when you're at like now Pix 11, you're like trying to build out like your career, right? And you are having to face, because I always think about that, right? Because I'm all like, I haven't gotten to a point in my life, like of course I faced things in my life about being Muslim or about being Bengali, right? But I haven't come to a point in my life where it would just be easier for me to not acknowledge that part of me at all.
Yeah.
Like I'm sure it would have been easier throughout life, but people like can look at me and say like, hey, I'm a brown man, right?
I
like
think
I'm a Muslim
especially
man.
in a newsroom, and we start every morning with an editorial meeting. You start this morning with a discussion of like the day's current events and the day's stories and how stories are going to be assigned. And a big part of the discussion has to be from my experience, and knowing what's going on in my communities. Now, if there are stories that are pertaining to Muslims or a particular part of the world that affects New Yorkers here, I can speak to that. And sometimes I would really have to, it's not necessarily a fight, it's a very respectful pushback that you have to give sometimes in a professional setting to make people, to make people understand, that this story matters, telling this side of the story matters, because there are some people that come from experiences, they have no clue about why this story should even matter to New York.
Let me ask you, is this a real conversation that happens? Because that's what I'm thinking as everything that's going on with like Gaza and Palestine, right? And Israel.
This time and you could put this in a different category of the most complicated times in a newsroom
But do you think that those conversations are happening like in those rooms? Because like I think like if you're like millennial, anybody who's like on social media, your vision of it, especially from our demographic, is that like, yo, it's all very one-sided, right? And it sometimes I think like the output feels like that way.
Wrong. I think listen, I come from a point of view where I know how things work inside of a newsroom. And I know that sometimes in a lot of places, our voices really are listened to. And this is a specific instance where there has been a lot of silence, especially in the beginning of the coverage, over one particular side, and that's the Palestinian voice. And a lot of Muslim journalists behind the scenes and in front of the camera have faced a lot of difficulties in their newsrooms. This is a fact. And has that changed over the last few weeks? They're working on it. And we owe so much to our journalists that are doing their best in the newsroom and pushing forward and persevering in terms of bringing the right stories to the forefront. Now, is there resistance in some places to fully tell them? There's no question. But if the fundamentals of journalism matter to a person in a newsroom, and if you think about why we are doing the job, you're doing the job to inform the public, not to share your opinion. And when there is something so deeply important happening in this world, you have a responsibility to the public to share all sides of it.
But do you think that, like, this is maybe like me as like a cynic now, do you think that that level of journalistic integrity like exists? Like, I think
You don't have enough time in your show to talk about that with me.
no,
I have a
seriously,
lot of
no,
opinions on
seriously,
it.
like I always like wonder that because I'm all like, yo, I think like my generation's like perception of like news, like or general news
No,
media
and it comes from the
outlets.
right place. I think what's become really challenging. Listen, I come from like a really old school place of journalism. I do. I don't believe in opinion newscasts. I don't believe in like editorial shows. I think we've frayed so far into this muck in this business and we've in America in particular, like so many Americans are so deeply uninformed about things going on in their community, this country, and this world. Why? I blame a lot of it on the way we've been delivering our news. And it's because it's still a business, right? It's become more of a business. There's more competition than ever before. They have to make money. And sometimes what drives more viewership? Is it talking about former President Trump 24/7? Or is it talking about the kids that are suffering in other parts of the world and poverty or this conflict?
How does that like news like and I was talking to you about it outside. How does that news end up disseminating through like the newsroom, right? Because we're talking about like specifically like the situation in Palestine right now, right? So we're seeing like some sharing of facts, right? But I would say that we're also seeing some sharing of facts not being shared, right?
I think
Like
the
some
best
facts
advice
not being
I can
shared.
give in terms of how people consume information is stop expecting social media to give you the whole truth, number one. And number two, check your sources. This is something people have become extraordinarily lazy about. They see, they post, they repost, and they don't check the original source of information. And we've seen this happen on both sides, where you'll see something, and if you really want to go do that deep dive through where that image came from, where that video came from, or where that infographic came from, you might find that it's a few years old, that it's bogus or came from some, kind of nonsense, blogger or something.
I'm gonna push back here a little
Go
bit,
for it.
right? Because
Yeah.
I think that like that's like I get it, like because that's what my roommate says to me all the time. He's like, "Yo, like I get that," because I'm such a cynic when it comes to news that I just don't even listen.
Cynicism is not a bad.
But I just don't watch
should
it
ask
anymore.
questions.
But it's not that, and that's what I want to push back on, right? That I think that like when I look at like news, right, I expect them to give me both sides in a clear, objective way, so I can come. But like for me to say like, hey, I trust you to give me the news, but then I have to go make an opinion-based opinion.
And you're not wrong here. I think that in itself and what you said right there shows exactly the distrust that the media industry has created over the last few years. And they need to get it back because they have become a source of so much, not only like, I don't want to say misinformation, but not fair and a balanced and balanced in all sides presentation of current events. You've lost trust in the public, and that's why have people gone to other sources? Because you've lost their trust, and it's something that if they care about getting viewership back, and frankly caring about getting people to respect them again, there's some work to do. I think it's not a perfect industry. I think it's suffered a lot. But I also think we have such incredible journalists who are really trying to do the work, and producers behind the scenes that are really trying to do the work. And there are voices there really trying to push it forward. And not just the narrative you want to hear, but all stories and narratives on all sides. Because our job as journalists, I strongly believe, is never to push our opinions down your throat. It is to literally give you facts, and you should be able to sit at home and decipher and use critical thinking to establish your own opinions.
I think that most people would say in that spot, and that what I'm going to say in that spot is that like it's not that I'm scared that like the individual journalist or the individual anchor is trying to push down their thoughts. My fear is that it's each of these businesses, corporations that are trying to push down their opinion on our thoughts, right? Because at the end of the day, like these are the people who are writing the checks. These are the people who are making the ultimate
And this
decision.
is where I tell you that this is where critical thinking applies. And if you are able to recognize things that you feel like you're being fed something that's inaccurate, then you go to other places. I wake up in the morning and I don't just read one headline of the same story. I read it from multiple sources. In this particular conflict, I read Israeli newspapers. I read Palestinian stories from Palestinian journalists, and I read everything in between of the same exact attack or siege or whatever happened the night before. I'm reading 5 to 6 to 7 different versions of the same exact stories to formulate and understand what happened, and to really get the garbage of opinion out of my brain, but to really understand in context what happened.
Okay, educate me. How are you reading this, right? Like how are you reading?
Nobody has that kind of time, right?
How are you reading this specific situation, and how are you just reading like news as it's presented today, right? Like let's just take
I don't think there's an easy answer. Like for me, I'm also like a mother to 2 kids and trying to like juggle getting them out the door for school and trying to be active in other places, right? But it's something that as a journalism student, these things were ingrained in me. I took classes in foreign reporting, in covering international terrorism, in media law and ethics. And one of the biggest lessons was you can't just speed read your way through current events. If you want to really understand something, you can't just be an expert like speed reader and pretend to know what you're talking about. You really have to grasp and understand context. So, I mean, what I do is something that's not normal for the normal individual. Like I know that. It's because this was my profession.
Yeah.
And I believe personally, if I'm gonna even post a single social media post that day, that I have a responsibility to know all of the information.
It's crazy because like I hear you saying that, right? But I don't think that level of discernment is shared by the mass, right? And that's like what I guess like kind of like I used to be like super into politics. I was a political science major, right? Like I was just like very involved. And I think like what bothered me was the fact that like nobody actually wanted to look at everything, right? They wanted to look at the side that they had already like pre-agreed upon and then just stick to just the information sources that help support it, right? Like in so many of the things that have going on, right? Like I think just even in COVID, right? Like I had friends that were so predominantly on one side and I was like, damn, I'm not good enough to know about both sides equally well to challenge your thinking on this, right? So I'm not even going to say anything. But they were all so well informed about just their side. So every time I talk to one person or the other, I'd be like, "Oh, it makes sense."
Now too, right? I mean, I think sometimes there's this, and I think this happened during, maybe it showed up much in a stronger way, I guess, during the last presidential election, right? And it felt like people were just constantly fighting their own point of views without stopping for a minute to listen to one another, and merely listening to another person's experience, existence, thoughts, opinions in a silent way and really taking it in and understanding it, and then in return being able to voice your own, right? This space of like shared thought has suddenly become so foreign. I mean, that's the existence I feel like I'm the space I feel like I'm living in sometimes now, where there's such this inability to listen or hear or understand and view all human beings as the same is baffling to me. Like that's the space I'm living in today as a mother, as a Muslim. That's where I'm at.
It's so like I always like find it like challenging because I feel like we're always around like people who agree with us just by pure demographic, by pure
Echo chambers,
right? And it's like hard to get out of because like I always think about it, I'm like, damn, how are they doing all of this? But like everyone I talk to
a lot of
is
people
like
stay in these echo chambers because it feels safer, right? I mean, in this moment, I will say, I fully support people who want to remain in safe spaces because I know there's so many people that feel so unsafe with their words and their skin and their faith right now. So right now, if you want to sit in your own space and sit with your own people and work together and not be in a space where you feel like your every word is being policed, I think it's an okay space to be at.
But that's not where the work. But I would say that that's not where the work gets done. Like I don't think.
I think you'd be surprised to know that there's actually a lot of work happening right now within the Muslim community.
But we're not trying to convince other Muslims that, what's happening is wrong, right? Like, we're trying to convince everybody else, right? Yeah. Like, not everybody else, right? Because I don't want to say like that's just a Muslim issue, right?
No, but I get what you're saying. I think what it is really a lot of the work is what's difficult. I'll say this is because we come from like, you're the 90s kid and I'm the 80s kid, right? Mm-hmm. I think one of the hard things that us 80s kids, Muslim immigrants of Arab and Bangladeshi and, South Asian and Arab backgrounds are having a real issue with today is that we really felt, maybe I say foolishly, we foolishly thought that we worked our way into spaces that our parents were never given a seat. Mm-hmm. Here we are, journalists, working in finance, working in, you're leading, your hospital, you're a chief of staff, you're an entrepreneur, you're everywhere. Mm-hmm. And yet in this moment, none of that matters. And I think it's a rude awakening, but I really think like the 90s kids, like you guys, have such a fire in you and such this amazing ability to push forth and say, despite that, we're going to keep amplifying. Because there's a defeatist attitude that some people feel. It's not, we're not done. We're feeling like disappointed that we didn't see that in this moment, that suddenly we've been diminished to not matter.
But it's so tough because like if you really believe that, and like I think like that's where it's like challenging, right? Yeah. Is like that I want to be like defeated, right? But then I know that doesn't carry it a little bit further, right? Because like, hey, like you were the first in the field that you were the first in, right? But now I'm imagining, there's 4 Narmeens coming up in 5-6 years, right? And then they become like a majority in that. Like that's what drives me, right? Like I think that's what drives me because I'm all like, hey.
That's one of the things that we talk about in these spaces is kind of right now the conversation is, you feel really sad, But then it's also like, but we're not going to stay sad. We're going to be empowered by this and know what didn't work for the previous generations, what didn't work before, and what do we do now to make sure that people understand that our voices exist, they matter, they count, and you can't ignore us. Like, people keep talking about post 9/11, right? I was in college then. Mm-hmm. And people keep talking about this post 9/11 feeling that like Muslim Americans were made to feel. And even then I distinctly remember like so much of the conversation in the Muslim community being like, keep your head down, focus on what you're doing, finish school, do your job, don't ruffle feathers. And we grew up and we're like, no, you're supposed to ruffle feathers. Like, it's important to ruffle feathers because you remind them that you exist. Your voice is important.
All you lawyers, doctors, finance people, y'all are important, right?
Y'all are
important, very important.
Very important.
But we got to push that a little bit further. And that's like what really, because I think that what bothers me and where it's necessary is that like, we do need to amplify these stories. We need to reshare on Instagram, right? But some of us also have to go to those like places and rooms where they're driving real decisions, right? Because I think a lot of us like we just get like,
a lot of us. People are in there. I think right now there's this interesting moment where some are still being censored in so many ways, and
but they're being censored because they're not the power there, right? Like I think that's I think the argument. Like I agree that they're there, and I'm sure they're working, right? Yeah. But when you're the one voice. Of course you're outnumbered, right?
So does that tell us that we just haven't gotten far enough?
We haven't gotten far enough. Mm-hmm. And that makes sense, right? Like where we are as like a people, think about it. America, like in the last 50 to 60 years has even identified certain people as being fully people, right? So what we think in 60 years we did what they've been doing for the last like 200?
Yeah,
or we're in the rooms where they worked, because you said it yourself, right? Somebody's frat brother ends up being that, right? You know what ends up happening in a generation? That I'm that frat brother, mm-hmm. right? Like that's like the only thing that like really drives me.
There's a big thing now, like a lot of things, and I guess I don't know if it's like being a parent, but we're now in spaces where we have these networking connections in our industries, in our communities itself. And we know we're already giving our families a better foundation than we had coming up.
Mm-hmm.
And it will only improve with future generations. We're still new to this. But yeah, I think our lives as immigrant products of immigrants in this country, yeah, it's a work in progress.
I'm just curious because you're like me, like however 7 years from now, right? How are you approaching that with your daughters, right?
Yeah.
How are you approaching that with your daughters,
Approaching,
right? Like how, what does like that messaging look like? The messaging that we got from our parents is
Yeah.
like, yo, play it safe, get the degree, get the job, right?
tell my sassy girls to play it safe. I know they're
Yeah.
yeah, they're a product of me. Listen, and I didn't play it safe. I got to say, like one of the jokes with my aunts, my khalas, was always because my mother was always very timid, and they were like, "How are you her daughter?" Because she was the one that would hide behind my nani's skirt, and they're like, they would laugh that she got this rebellious girl, and my mom used to tell me, "You should have been a boy."
Yeah.
I don't know if it was because like of what I said. I was rebellious. I definitely like fought against a lot of the restrictions I had in life. And with my girls, like I mean, I encourage them, like, you can do anything you want. But I also emphasize the importance, like, they go to Islamic school on Sundays. They know their culture. I took them to Bangladesh in July for a month, because I really want them to have a connection to their motherland. You know, like, this is where your nana and nani came from, and you should know it. Listen, I think I'm winging the parenting thing when it comes to I don't have a playbook. I know there are parenting books, but I don't have the patience to read them. But I do think I want them to feel as empowered brown girls. I want them to know. I actually like hear this often. Like, it's important for children to know that they are different. You are not like everybody else that you go to school with.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad thing. I flip it on them. It's an empowering thing. You are not ashamed of where you come from. You are not ashamed of your brown skin. You are not ashamed of being a Muslim girl. And so I'm all about empowering my little girls.
No, that's fire that you're doing it early too, because I think that's like something that like I had to like learn about myself, right? That like, the fact that I'm brown and the fact that I'm unique, like that's what makes me fly, right? Like that, the fact that I am this like unique expression of whoever, right? That I'm not this like whatever that they like wanted me to be, right?
We used to walk to school. The older one, who's 9 now, we used to walk to school, to pre-K, and people used to look down like, who is this little kid talking? We used to walk to school with these daily affirmations. I am brown, I am beautiful, and I'm smart. And she used to just chant this down the street as we're walking to school on 2nd Avenue in Manhattan.
Because whether they want it or not, like I think like some parents have the opposite like approach where they're just like, oh, you're just like everybody else, right? But like the reality is like you could tell your kid that and you could think that of your kid.
I don't remember where I saw that, but it was something, not that I was telling them that you're same as everybody else, or it wasn't that, but I also was like, when I heard that for the first time, I was like, this makes sense. They should know they're different, but different in the most beautiful way.
Absolutely. Narmeen, I think we're like running up on time. But I just want to say, first of all, thank you for doing this.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And thank you for like what you've done, right? Because like I think like that's why I was telling Dad, if you're listening, right? My dad was so excited for this because he's obviously like a journalist, and to see somebody that like look like us and is from where we're from, like on Pix 11 News.
So much.
Last
shout out to him.
Last personal question, right? Just because this is just like a me unique thing.
Yeah.
How's Mr. G in person? Is he cool?
Mr. G's a sweetheart.
Okay, amazing.
He's a
that
sweetheart.
it would have broken my heart if I found out that Mr. G was not the nicest guy in the world, because I've been watching him since I was a kid.
I would go to get coffee with him, and it's like you can't walk a half a block with him because people are stopping him all the time. He's a sweet, sweet man.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think we're good, right? I didn't want to take over more of your time, but thank you so much. Thank you. Oh.
Ooh, right on time.
Yeah.